energy and air pollution will be one of the top 5 issues for the general election.
We talk about Putin being in control. He's not really. It's the various factions under him, and it suits them to have him at the front.
If you're trying to save for a house deposit and you'd have to save up some crazy amount of money, how on earth are you going to do that if a pint is £7?
There's certain key things that we want from India, and there's certain key things that they want from us.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to the programme. Ewan, have you been making any prank calls?
Yeah, always. I mean, mostly what I do every day.
It's you that does it. How did I not know this? I'm referencing a story that was in The Sun over the weekend saying that Rishi Sunak's long-time personal mobile number was leaked online.
Yeah, apparently social media pranksters, to use the tabloid parlance.
I
bet
you've called someone a prankster in your time, Ian Potts.
Look, pranksters, stop calling the PM. Apparently they called the PM's private number and got his answer phone message. This is, of course, remember, 2.5 years after Boris Johnson was forced to change his mobile number after a similar leak. The Sun says that Sunak was given a new separate number when he came into power a year ago, but the old number continues to be in use. I'm surprised this doesn't happen more often, because you think how many people have these senior politicians' phone numbers. I'm thinking of journalists in particular. I mean, I haven't got Rishi Sunak's number, but I've got quite a lot of journalists' phone numbers.
Politicians' phone numbers?
Yes.
You've got journalists' phone numbers as well.
I've got journalists' phone numbers as well.
That's just for prank calls, though, as previously discussed.
I don't tend to leak them, but I mean, you can see the temptation if you were that way inclined to do it. So I'm surprised this doesn't happen more often.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not surprised he didn't answer his phone. I don't know anyone that answers their phone anymore when someone actually rings them.
Phone calls, horrible.
But perhaps these pranksters, as dictated to by the Sun, were calling to leave a message asking for tax cuts, maybe. This is after a series of newspaper reports over the weekend saying that Rishi Sunak's considering a stamp duty reduction and other tax cuts for top earners after the Conservative Party's latest by-election defeat. So there's a couple of these reports floating around in the newspapers over the weekend. The Times saying that senior Tories wanted to include the stamp duty cut in a general election manifesto as a promise to perhaps help the Tories improve their performance in the next election. The Telegraph, meanwhile, saying that a tax cut for the UK's 5 million highest earners is also being considered. So apparently Downing Street's been carrying out surveys to find out which move would boost the party the most ahead of the general election, and perhaps there could be measures announced even as early as the 2024 spring budget. We've been told, of course, again and again that the scope for doing anything in the autumn statement is very limited because of the lack of fiscal headroom, for want of a better expression. Basically, there's no money.
There's no cash.
Yeah. But this an interesting bit of kite flying.
Yeah, it's almost exactly a month now till the autumn statement. 22nd November we're going to get that. As you say, we've been told no big juicy announcements, so we'll see if that happens. Though we did get those public borrowing figures last week, which showed stronger tax receipts and lower debt interest payments for the month of September. Of course, the reason that the government is thinking about changing the high rate threshold is because they've frozen it for all the years up to 2027, and that's going to drag a lot of people into higher rate income tax if they continue with that. So it's kind of undoing the policy that they announced when money was super tight last year.
More tax chat to come in the run-ups to the autumn statement, of course. But let's turn our focus to technology. We're just over a week away from the UK's flagship Artificial Intelligence Summit. The government wants countries to sign up to a common approach on AI and thinks it can lead the world in hammering out a dialogue around this technology. Now, politicians have long tried to claim the UK's aiming to be a tech super hub like Silicon Valley. Our reporter Mark Bergen's been writing about this and whether the UK's tech scene really lives up to the hype. Mark, great to have you with us on the show. We speak to many politicians on this show, and when they want to talk up the UK, we hear about tech and AI and our startup culture. How much should we believe of that hype?
I'll start with the don't believe much case, and then I can go to the bull case and to believe more than maybe you have in the past.
Okay.
I do think. I mean, you know, there's a. Do you remember the Silicon Roundabout, which I think was almost a decade ago, right?
Infinitely less glamorous than a valley, but yeah.
Just going through the list of companies initially from there, and I will confess I had not heard of any of them.
We'll put you on a bus later and send you around.
Yeah, they're certainly, you know,
certainly this year got off to a terrible start for in UK tech with ARM decamps to New York. We have Revolut, the most valuable startup in the UK and Europe, has just been locked in this battle with the government over the banking license. Kind of fintech in general has come down tremendously from its pretty high, probably arguably too high valuation. Deliveroo has not really performed as well since going public, and there's just not this sort of pipeline that you have in Silicon Valley, in India now, in Asia, in China, of companies doing tremendously fast growth and then having an exit, either an IPO or a sale. And then we talk about AI. There's none of the really big, the generative AI, these kind of new wave of AI companies have emerged here, with the asterisk being DeepMind, which is part of Google, and sort of still, I think, the kind of crown jewel of London tech scene. That being said, I do think there are a lot of opportunities for one company here in the north calls itself Boring AI. I think it's pretty apt for a lot of. There are a lot of enterprise applications. They're not making ChatGPT, but they're certainly kind of selling business software that has a pretty successful and often profitable business. There are, as I read about this morning, there are a lot of companies in the life sciences and biotech and healthcare where the UK is really punching above its weight.
You mentioned ARM and Deliveroo. That's really about the kind of relative decline of the London sort of listings market, isn't it? If we look at this sort of underlying technology, though, the UK startup scene is still pretty robust, isn't it?
Compared to what?
Compared to the rest of Europe? Am I wrong in that?
No, I think that's right. I think there's certainly pockets, and the UK is right now. Paris, with the French government, has certainly been making, and this is one of several pushes here, where they're making a big investment. What I think you can kind of separate two things. One is just sort of our current still hype cycle around artificial intelligence and these companies in AI, and that is about innovation. That's about having a lot of engineers, which the UK does have. Obviously the academic institutions are probably some of the best in Europe and the world, but it's also about money. And frankly, the UK government has come out and they've set a program for quantum computing and supercomputers, and the outlays there are just paltry compared to what the US and China, which is expected, right? It's
and is that really what's key to actually having a healthy startup scene? It's essentially having a giant bag of cash, or at least other people nearby who have giant bags of cash and are willing to spend them on your new company.
It's sort of, if you look at, say, the AI right now in Silicon Valley, it is giant bags of cash coming from Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Nvidia, and weirdly, like those giant bags of cash, they're all the four of those companies are investing heavily in startups. All the startups are spending heavily on NVIDIA chips and cloud with Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. And then you have the sort of the Sand Hill Row, Silicon Valley investment venture firms would had put in a lot more money. What you've now in Europe in particular, there were two during the big bubble period of 2020 and 2022, there was Tiger Global and SoftBank that were investing an enormous sums of money. They've virtually disappeared. SoftBank has come back with much smaller deals. And Europe has just typically been Europe and the UK maybe 5 years behind.
Yeah, because you mentioned this in your piece today that the startup financing is falling, and you do say it is a problem everywhere, but it does seem particularly pronounced in the UK as well.
I think that's right. I don't think it's certainly not an outlier compared to the rest of Europe, but it's fallen kind of across the board. That's just the tough market. A lot of venture capital firms are now readjusting and talking a lot about, maybe we actually need to see profits as opposed to just unbridled growth.
So what about the PM's AI summit? There's been a lot of hype about this, or a lot of attempted hype from the government. What's the view in industry? Is this a big deal, or is it just another government thing?
There is a little bit of eye rolling. I do think there's, which comes with both of these government initiatives. I think there's the easy joke here is that the UK is trying to position itself as a global leader on AI, and so it's invited companies most from the US. From what we can tell of the invite list so far. That being said, there's a really interesting the government has, and this is something that a lot of startups and investors talk about too, as a sort of maybe silver lining of Brexit, is like this opportunity to to regulate in a way that
and to be able
different.
to diverge from, because I mean, when you think about GDPR, the European privacy standard, it's seen as setting a kind of global standard for that as well. So that's one of the opportunities being pointed out today by one of Facebook's co-founders. Who's talking about the idea of this being an opportunity for the UK to be able to do that. That's Dustin Moskovitz, who's been interviewed by the Times newspaper.
I agree, and I think that is it's certainly the case where there's an opportunity here. It's unclear. As far as I know, the government hasn't come out with very concrete policies of what that looks like, and a lot of the conversation here is about extreme existential risks, biological weapons, AI being used in warfare, or even the sort of long-termist is the term, this thinking that AI is going to destroy us all. And there's certainly people in the camp in the tech world that disagree strongly with that. And so this does feel a little more philosophical than regulatory, or I don't necessarily know that they're, going to set in policies that will improve the UK startup scene, but who knows? That they might. I think that's what they're looking for.
You mentioned in your piece that there are some companies which are doing well in the UK. Tell us more about that sector.
Yeah, I looked. I think kind of under the radar are life sciences and biotech, and there have been a couple interesting IPOs. And there's Oxford Nanopore. There's some large sort of privately held companies now as well. And I think this is where there's some data that even during the pandemic, the funding has stayed pretty solid and resilient for health services, companies that have paired up with the NHS or even expanded to the US, and biotech. So there's a lot of interesting companies applying AI to discovering new drugs and treatments, or doing genetics work, or working on sort of new medical devices. And a lot of these companies have spun out of Oxford, Cambridge, and even some smaller universities. And I think that's where the UK's advantage is, and there's been a little bit of government support. You talk to startups that say that's been very useful. I don't think it gets enough attention as AI.
Because it does come across as sort of being the flashy new thing that everyone's trying to get their attention on. But I mean, is there merit in the idea of having this summit in the UK? Is the UK putting itself out there as somewhere that could help to shape the guardrails that many in industry believe this technology needs to have?
I mean, my understanding is there's merit to the UK got there first, right?
Yes.
This is the first sort of global, and I think from my understanding is this will be something they want to have maybe every single year in different places, and sort of this, people have talked about a kind of a UN style global regulatory body. I do think, and this is my bias maybe coming as an American here, but the UK navigating that line with China and the US and this the tension. I mean, I think the most interesting story about the summit is that China's been invited. It's something that if you had a summit in the US, that would very be unlikely. And so maybe that's going to be quite a political feat to be able to navigate that, and especially what we now have increased tension around the supply chain and everything to do with the trade war. And I think that's just only going to get more geopolitical and difficult as we go forward.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned the guest list and long list of invitees from America. Are they all going to turn up? Is this going to be a success?
I think our reporting suggests we still have a lot of companies are saying that they're waiting on the plans.
Just a week to go.
Yeah, and I think there's some. I don't know if we're going to expect to see, say, the CEOs of Microsoft and Google and Meta, but we will certainly see probably, I think, the Nick Clegg's and Brad Smith, who runs policy, and there's confirmed is the head of DeepMind and Google sort of head of AI policy. And so maybe not the bigger names that we're used to. Elon is certainly one that everyone's kind of waiting to see, despite him not necessarily having expertise in AI.
think of the seating plans being thrown into chaos.
Yes,
by the
if anyone has
RSVPs.
the seating chart, please send it our way.
I'm not organising that
exactly,
meal.
Yeah. Our tech reporter Mark Bergen, thanks so much for joining us as we look ahead to the AI summit taking place next week.
Well, Michael Gove's Renters Reform Bill is back in the Commons for a second reading today. The flagship legislation by the Housing Secretary seeks to end no-fault evictions and to strengthen tenants' rights. But some Tory backbenchers are unhappy at the restrictions on landlords' rights, warning the changes could see more of them leaving the market, further driving up rents. The debate on this bill was pushed back on several occasions, something our Caroline Hepker asked the Housing Minister Rachel Maclean about at the Tory party conference earlier this month.
Well, I'm very proud of this legislation. It's already been introduced into Parliament. We've all stood on a manifesto commitment to abolish that Section 21, which is what you're talking about. Yes. That's the no-fault eviction clause, which we know is a leading cause of homelessness. We will bring that bill forward, hopefully very, very soon, because it's important that we deliver on that promise to young people.
So that was the Housing Minister Rachel Maclean talking about the bill hopefully being brought forward. We now know that it is moving ahead with that debate continuing the second reading in Parliament today. Let's bring in our residential real estate reporter Damian Shepherd for more about this story. So the Renters Reform Bill, Damian, is a whole package of reforms. What are the sort of big changes involved in it?
Yeah, so I mean, this is something that's been long campaigned for. I follow all of the renters groups on Twitter, and there's a lot of excitement but nervousness about this finally making some progress. I think the headline thing in there is undoubtedly the potential abolishment of the Section 21 eviction. I mean, as things stand, a landlord can remove somebody from their property with no reason and give them simply 2 months' notice to find somewhere else. If you just use right now as a case study, I mean, I live in London, I'm a renter. If I was to be given a 2-month notice to leave my property, I'd then be heading into the abyss of trying to find somewhere to live at a time where supply is squeezed to levels we've rarely seen before in the capital. So to remove this for renters would be a huge win for these groups that have been campaigning for a very long time.
It's not just the Section 21 reforms, though, is it? There is other stuff wrapped up in this, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another one of the big things is the abolishment of fixed-term tenancies. So the bill, as it looks at the moment, would allow a tenant to come into a property and be able to leave essentially as they please. I mean, one of the big issues that the renters groups speak about is you'll lock yourself into a 1-year contract, move into a flat, and it won't really be up to the standard that it was advertised. There might be serious issues in the property, but you're tied into it. So that would kind of remove that concern that you'd be locked into paying these monthly bills for a year. You'd be able to leave as you please. But on the other side of that, among landlord groups, there's severe concern that their properties could be used as short-term lets. People could kind of come and go and there'd be no sort of long-term security for them in terms of income. So there's really big debates going on both sides, which we're going to see more and more of as the months go on.
Yeah, and it's certainly part of the pressure that exists in that sector because a lot of the issues because of rising interest rates mean that those buy-to-let landlords are leaving the market, and if there are concerns about continuity over earnings, then that's going to perhaps put more of them under pressure as well. Among those landlords, though, are some Tory MPs, and it's fair to say this isn't terribly popular for them. What's the kind of gist of their argument against some of these reforms?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a big headache for the Tories right now. I mean, typically a lot of people who vote Tory are landlords themselves. So on the Section 21 evictions, for example, naturally the court process will be leaned on a lot more now. Landlord groups will argue that process is extremely slow. So there are talks that the government aren't going to proceed with the Section 21 abolishment until there's something in place to speed up these court processes. And also, like I said, with the 6-month period of commitment that pro-landlord groups are lobbying the government for to ensure that a tenant will have to stay for 6 months rather than being able to leave after a month if the property isn't up to standard, for example. That is a real concern for them because people could use them as short-term lets. But yeah, that's a real headache for both sides. There's going to be a lot of debate around this. It's a real fine line for the Tories.
Yeah, has the government made many concessions to the potential rebels?
Well, I mean, you'd have to ask those who are in Parliament. But we saw over the weekend a Times report that the Tories are considering stamp duty reductions and other tax cuts for top earners. So there's a real scramble right now between Labour and the Conservatives to kind of win these points on housing. We saw earlier in the month at the Labour Party conference, there was pledges to raise stamp duty for foreign buyers and use that to fix all of the problems in the planning system. So you're seeing these two parties locking horns at the moment on an issue that could potentially define the election.
Damian, talk us through the state of the market. You mentioned that you're a renter. I'm a renter as well. I think most of the conversations that I have with people in London is about a fear of when their lease is going to be renewed because of how much their rent might go up by. What is the state of the market now in terms of the rising rents, landlords leaving the market?
Yeah, so we're undoubtedly seeing that. Landlords are leaving the market. We were talking earlier about high interest rates, and typically the mortgages that landlords on, these interest rates feed right through to their payments, as opposed to sort of your standard homeowner who's on a fixed rate. Now, landlords feel that pain, but the reality is renters feel it even harder, because in order to recuperate those costs that they're losing through the higher rates, that goes down to renters who will then be hit with, a higher annual rent bill. And again, landlords will know that if they were to Section 21 remove a tenant, for example, or not renew their contract at the end of a tenancy, it's highly likely that they're going to get more on the open market, because people are so desperate to rent a property. This is causing a real mess. We were saying we're both renters. I viewed a property in Wimbledon. It must have been 4 or 5 months ago. There was just one day of viewings, and there were 40 separate viewings in one day. And that said to me, this is really challenging, and I'm going to have to take any rent rise I get, because I don't want to head into this rental market and try and fight for a property. You're hearing stories about people even writing a 200-word bio to try and win over the landlord to let their property out to them. There's a real mess. Rents are rocketing, supply is squeezed. And everyone's looking towards Labour and the Conservatives to see how they're going to sort this out.
This is getting into the territory of people writing letters to people selling houses, telling them how much they'd love to live there, which is something I thought only existed in American films, but apparently is a real thing. That people make heartfelt appeals to be able to buy houses, apparently not now moving into the rental market as well.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, there's some strange things happening, and it's desperation.
I was asked you about that spike in rents that you mentioned over the past year. Are those increases starting to moderate now? Because we've seen really big increases, haven't we, particularly in London?
Yeah, so they're undoubtedly still growing, but the rate of the growth is starting to slow. So that's kind of a bit of reassurance that we might have reached the peak of these massive hikes in rent. That's a glimmer of hope for renters, that their bills may eventually start to come down slightly, and it gives landlords a little more room to manoeuvre on hiking rents at the end of a cycle of contract. That's a slight reassurance, but don't get me wrong, rents are incredibly high.
This is lining up to be a major issue in the next election as well. You mentioned there some of the reports that we saw over the weekend about a potential cut to stamp duty. What do you make so far of the policy promises or hints that we've seen from the parties in terms of what they're going to do around house building? Do you think it is going to be that central issue in the election?
Yeah, it looks that way. I think particularly with the Labour conference, there was, committing to 1.5 million homes over the course of the next Parliament if they win. I think what was interesting about that is they didn't commit to an annual target. They sort of have given themselves a little bit of wiggle room over a 5-year term if they win, to answer the questions about where these houses are. But it comes down to the root of the issue, which I've spoken about many times before on here, about the lack of housing in the UK, and until supply is increased, house prices are going to remain high. Also in the rental market, until more rental homes are built, rent prices are going to remain high. So I think with the Labour promises around fixing the planning system, building these new towns and promoting home building, it's very much more long-term goals than the short-term pain right now that we're seeing. So it's, whether voters are going to take that long-term view, particularly the young ones who are hoping one day to own their property and not be stuck in the rental market.
And a quick one on the stamp duty cuts. Talk of that in one of the newspaper reports this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's really interesting. I think the way that we're seeing the Tories and Labour potentially going different ways. We see in the Times this weekend about the Tories considering reductions to stamp duty. And then you look over to the other side and you see Labour saying we're going to hike it for foreign buyers and prioritise first-time buyers, in a big tower of new apartments. They want it to be domestic buyers, not those overseas home buyers. So, I think comparing how the two parties are looking at housing is going to be really fascinating as we move towards these crucial stages of the lead up to the election.
Okay. Damian Shepherd, our residential real estate reporter, thanks so much for joining us with the latest on that story. And I know that you love talking about the housing market, and I feel like we're going to be leaning into that quite a lot over the next year or so. It certainly sounds like where the politicians are directing us anyway. Yeah,
it's certainly going to be a big issue in the next election. I don't think it's in the top 5 big issues, but it does normally come just outside that, and there are very strong views, I think, on both sides, from younger voters and from older voters. It's going to be fascinating as we approach the election.
And we'll be watching out for what that second reading of the Renters Reform Bill throws up in terms of those potential divisions among the Tory party, as well as we look to see how Labour chooses to position themselves around these changes as well. Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock and our audio engineer was Maruful Hussain. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.